How can you continue to deny the catastrophic impact of your actions? We are taking every measure to ensure safety protocols are followed.
The press conference had been running for 11 minutes when Elara Voss stopped listening to the spokesperson. She had positioned herself at the back of the room, one shoulder against the wall, arms loose at her sides. The posture of someone with no particular stake in what was happening at the podium. A glass of water in her left hand that she had not touched since they handed it to her at the door. The journalists were doing what journalists do when they smell something wrong. Asking the same question 4 different ways. Waiting for the version that accidentally tells the truth. The spokesperson was holding. Barely, but Elara was not watching the spokesperson. She was watching the man in the 3rd row from the front. Left center seat. Dark suit, no tie. A folder on his lap that he had opened once in 11 minutes and not looked at since. He had not shifted in his chair, had not glanced at his phone, had not reacted to a single hostile question even when the journalist 2 seats to his left had used the word catastrophic twice in the same sentence. People who are innocent of something react to the word catastrophic. People who already know the outcome do not. Elara set her water glass on the ledge behind her without looking away from him. She had been in this room for 11 minutes. She already knew the scandal was not what anyone in this room thought it was. The question she had not yet answered, the one she had been turning over since the car ride here, was what she was going to do with that. Elara Voss did not have a company name. She had a number, a private line that fewer than 40 people in the world possessed. When they called it, they did not leave messages. They said their name, a single sentence describing the situation, and a figure. If the figure was sufficient, she called back within the hour. If it was not, she did not call back at all. She had been doing this for 9 years. In those 9 years, she had managed the public narrative around 3 government data breaches, 2 pharmaceutical trials that had ended badly and quietly, 1 inheritance dispute that had threatened to surface documents implicating 2 sitting cabinet members in a country that preferred to believe its cabinet members were not that kind of people. And 1 situation so specific and so sealed that she had never discussed it with anyone, not even the client, after the final invoice was paid. She was 38 years old. She lived in a flat with no photographs on the walls, and a kitchen that was used for coffee and nothing else. She was not the kind of person who made enemies. She was the kind of person who made herself so useful to powerful people that the powerful people could not afford to make an enemy of her. There is a difference. She had understood it early. She had built her entire career on it. What she had not built into her career was a contingency for the morning she walked into a situation and recognized the architecture of the manipulation before she understood what was being manipulated. That morning was this one. Before this story goes any further, this channel tells stories about the most dangerous person in the room, the one nobody noticed. Subscribe now, because once you see how these people think, you will never look at power the same way again. Meridian Identity Systems had been founded 17 years ago by a woman named Vivienne Armand. The company's public purpose was elegant and genuinely useful, a unified global digital identity infrastructure. One identity, verified once, recognized everywhere. By the time the first government signed a partnership agreement, Meridian had already built the architecture that would eventually underpin the identity verification systems of 31 countries. By the time Elara heard the company's name for the first time, Meridian was not a company anymore in any meaningful sense. It was infrastructure. The kind of infrastructure that does not get turned off, because too many things would stop working if it did. Vivienne Armand had not appeared in a public setting in 4 years. She gave no interviews. She had resigned her executive position 2 years earlier, citing personal reasons. She had not, as far as anyone could establish, left the industry. She had simply become invisible within it, which Elara would later understand was exactly the point. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Elara was standing at her kitchen counter, both hands around a cup of coffee she had made 4 minutes earlier and not yet drunk, looking at nothing in particular through the window above the sink. The voice on the other end was a man she had worked with twice before. He spoke for 45 seconds. He named a figure. He said one more thing before she could respond. He said Vivienne Armand had specifically requested her. Elara set her coffee down on the counter. She had met Vivienne Armand once, 7 years ago, at a private dinner for 12 people in a city she no longer visited. They had spoken for perhaps 20 minutes. Vivienne had asked her 3 questions. Not about her work, not about her clients, not about her methodology, about how she decided when something was worth protecting, and when it was not. Elara had given her 3 honest answers. Vivienne had nodded once and moved on to the person beside her. Elara had thought about those 3 questions on and off for 7 years, without entirely understanding why. She told the intermediary she would be there by Thursday. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. The briefing room was on the 14th floor of a building with no Meridian signage anywhere on its exterior. 3 people were waiting when Elara arrived. A legal counsel she did not recognize. A communications director she recognized from his public profile, but had never met. And a woman she had never seen before who sat at the far end of the table and said nothing for the first 12 minutes of the meeting. The situation as presented was this. 3 days earlier, Meridian's identity verification system had experienced what the company was calling a significant technical anomaly. Approximately 40,000 users across multiple countries had temporarily lost access to their verified credentials, unable to board flights, complete banking transactions, access government services. The anomaly had lasted between 6 and 14 hours, depending on the region. It had been resolved. The cause was under investigation. The public and media narrative was building around 2 words: breach and failure, neither of which the communications director was careful to say accurately described what had happened. Elara listened to all of this with her hands flat on the table and her expression neutral. Then she asked the question she always asked first. Elara says, flat and direct, "What is the part of this you have not told me yet?" The communications director looked at the legal counsel. The legal counsel looked at his folder. The woman at the far end of the table looked at Elara and smiled. Very slightly, very briefly, in a way that suggested the question had been expected and was considered correct. Raina says, professionally neutral, her name was Raina. She represented Vivienne Armand's personal interests in this matter, and the part they had not told her yet was the reason she had been requested specifically. Then Raina continues. 37 users had not had their access restored when the anomaly resolved. 37 users whose credentials had not experienced a technical failure. 37 users who no longer existed in the system at all. Elara spent the first night alone with the files. The conference room they had given her smelled of recycled air and new carpet. Someone had left a tray of food outside the door at 8 in the evening that she moved to one side without opening. She had 3 monitors set up. A legal pad she had brought herself, and a pen she had been using since the morning that was beginning to run dry. The 37 files were not what she had expected. She had expected, if she was being honest with herself about what kind of situation this might be, names that meant something. People with connections, with knowledge, with leverage. The kind of people whose disappearance from a system might benefit someone with access to that system. Instead, she found a teacher, a retired postal worker, a woman who ran a small bakery in a coastal town, a father of 3 who worked in municipal water management, a graduate student, a retired nurse. Ordinary people, people whose erasure from a digital identity system would not benefit anyone she could immediately identify. She read each file twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The erasures were not random. She could feel that before she could prove it. The same instinct that had kept her functional in 17 crisis situations over 9 years. There was a pattern here. She could not see it yet. But it was there the way a word is there on the tip of your tongue. Present and shapeable and just beyond reach. She pulled the legal pad toward her and began to write. Not notes, not yet. Just the question she needed to answer before she could do anything else. If these 37 people were erased to make room for something, what was the something? She met Vivienne Armand on the 3rd day. Not in the building. In a private room in a members' club that smelled of old wood and money that had stopped needing to announce itself 2 generations ago. Vivienne was already seated when Elara arrived. She had ordered tea for 2 without asking. She was wearing a jacket the color of slate. No jewelry except a watch that Elara recognized as rare without being able to name the manufacturer. She looked exactly as Elara remembered from 7 years ago. Slightly smaller in person than her reputation suggested. Completely still in the way that very few people manage to be completely still. Not the stillness of discomfort or control, but the stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with occupying exactly as much space as she needed, and no more. She did not ask how the engagement was going. She asked whether Elara had looked at the 37 files yet. Elara said she had. Vivienne poured the tea, handed Elara a cup. Waited. Elara set the cup down without drinking. Elara says, completely controlled, these people were not removed because they were threats. They were removed because they were available. Vivienne looked at her for a moment. Vivienne says, quietly, with the finality of something that was decided long ago, yes. Meridian's identity system was a closed ledger. Vivienne explained this the way someone explains something they have thought about for a very long time to someone they believe is capable of understanding it. Not simply, but completely. The system had been designed with a capacity limit, not a technical limit, a philosophical one, a hard ceiling on the number of verified identities the ledger could hold. Built into the architecture at the foundational level as a security measure against artificial population inflation. To write a new identity into the ledger, an existing one had to be removed. One in, one out. The system had been running at capacity for 3 years. Elara says slowly, working through it. Which means that for 3 years, every new identity written into this system has required someone's removal. Vivienne says, looking at her tea, yes. Elara says, and the 37 people were not removed because of anything they did, the narrator continues. They were selected because their removal would be least likely to surface quickly. Ordinary lives. Minimal digital footprint outside the system. People who would notice something was wrong, but whose reports would be processed slowly. Routed through standard support channels. Handled as individual technical complaints, rather than evidence of a pattern. Elara says, very quietly, who are the 37 new identities? Vivienne says, they are people who needed to stop being who they were, and who could afford the alternative. Elara says, how much? Vivienne told her. Elara sat with the number for a moment. Elara says, and you need me to make sure the public investigation into the anomaly does not reach this conclusion. Vivienne picks up her tea and says, I need you to make sure that the investigation reaches a conclusion that is technically accurate, professionally defensible, and completely beside the point. Elara went back to her conference room and sat in the dark for 40 minutes before turning the lights on. Then she opened her laptop and began to work. Not on the narrative. Not yet. On the architecture of what Vivienne had built. She was not looking for evidence. She was not building a case. She was doing what she always did in the first hours of understanding something. She was mapping it. Walking through it the way you walk through a building you have just been handed the keys to. Opening every door. Noting every room. Understanding the structure before deciding what to do with it. The ghost identity operation was elegant, in the way that only things built by someone who genuinely understood systems could be elegant. The capacity limit that made it possible was not a flaw that had been exploited. It was a feature that had been designed. The 37 ordinary people had not been chosen at random. They had been selected against 7 criteria that Elara identified over 4 hours of working backwards through the system's selection logic. Age range. Geographic distribution. Employment sector. Number of dependent relationships. Frequency of system interaction. Credit activity. And one final criterion that she sat with for a long time before she fully understood it. None of the 37 had anyone who would ask the right questions. Not no one who would miss them. People would miss them. People were already missing them. But no one who would look at 37 support tickets from 37 ordinary people in 37 different countries and understand that they were not 37 individual technical complaints. They were one decision. On the 5th day, Elara found the man from the press conference. His name was Marcus Hale. He was listed as a non-executive director of a subsidiary of a holding company that had a minor contractual relationship with Meridian. His name appeared nowhere in any document she had been given. She found him by following a payment trail so carefully obscured that finding it felt less like investigation and more like the system wanting to be found by someone who knew how to look. Marcus Hale had received a fee for services rendered. The services were described as strategic advisory, consultation on identity infrastructure resilience. The date of the contract was 3 weeks before the anomaly. The fee was a number that strategic advisory consultants do not receive for 3 weeks of identity infrastructure resilience consultation. Elara printed the document, folded it once, put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. Then she sat very still for a moment. Marcus Hale was not the architect of this. He was too visible, too documented, too findable. He was what someone placed in the structure when they needed a name to surface if the wrong person started looking. A designed fall position. Real enough to satisfy an investigation. Positioned far enough from the actual operation that following him would lead somewhere definitive and completely beside the point. Elara had built structures like this herself. She recognized the work. And she recognized with a clarity that arrived without warning, and sat in her chest with considerable weight, that the person who had built this particular structure was the same person who had taught her how. Vivienne came to her, not to the conference room, to the flat they had arranged for Elara near the building. A service apartment with a view of a canal, and furniture that had been chosen by someone with taste and no particular attachment to comfort. It was late. Elara had been awake for most of the previous 30 hours. She opened the door and looked at Vivienne and said nothing, and stepped back to let her in. Vivienne walked to the window. She looked at the canal for a moment. Then she turned. Vivienne says, completely settled, "I know what you found." Elara said nothing. Vivienne says, "I know what you found. And I know what you are considering doing with it. I have watched you work for 5 days. I know how you think. I requested you specifically because I know how you think." Elara says, flat, "You requested me because you needed someone good enough to manage this narrative, and you needed to be able to predict what they would do when they found out it was not a narrative." Vivienne says, "Yes." Elara says, "And what did you predict?" Vivienne says that you would find Marcus, that you would understand what he was, that you would trace it back to the correct conclusion, and that you would then spend approximately 30 hours deciding whether to do something about it. Elara says, "And?" Vivienne says, "And then I would come here and offer you what I am about to offer you." She sat down. She placed a tablet on the low table between them. She placed a glass of something on the table beside it, which Elara did not touch. Vivienne says, unhurried, each sentence landing separately, "The operation continues. It will continue regardless of what you do. The infrastructure is too embedded, too distributed, too essential to the systems that depend on it to be dismantled by one person's decision to speak. You know this. You understand how these things work better than almost anyone I have ever met. If you go to a regulator, you go with 37 support tickets and one obscured payment to a non-executive director. They will investigate. They will find what they are supposed to find. They will issue a finding. Meridian will cooperate fully. Nothing will change. Elara says, except that I will be the person who brought the finding. Vivienne says, which will make you very difficult to employ in this industry again, and will not help the 37 people whose identities have already been permanently removed from the system. Because the system does not restore. You have read the architecture. You know this. Elara knew this. Vivienne says, slower now, you have been doing this work for 9 years. You are exceptional at it. You are also exhausted by it. I have watched you this week. You are someone who has been carrying the weight of other people's decisions for a very long time without being asked whether you wanted to. She slid the tablet across the table. On the screen was a name, a file, a woman. 41. Primary school teacher. Lived alone. No children. One elderly parent in assisted care. Her identity had been in the selection queue for 6 weeks. She was next. Beside the file were 4 other names. 4 other files. Vivienne says, you may choose. Which one leaves the ledger? And Elara Voss enters it on the other side, clean, complete, untraceable. A new credential in a new name in a jurisdiction with no extradition agreements and a coastline, if that matters to you. She stood up. Vivienne says, I will need an answer. By morning. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. Vivienne says, quieter. I did not select you because you were talented. I selected you because 7 years ago, at a dinner for 12 people, you told me that you had once made a decision you were not proud of in order to protect something you believed was worth protecting, and that you had never entirely resolved whether you were right. She opened the door. Vivienne says, almost to herself, I thought you might be ready to stop resolving it. The door closed. Elara sat in the silence for a long time. Then she reached forward and picked up the glass Vivienne had left. She held it without drinking. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the 5 names. She looked at the canal through the window. She did not sleep. At 4:17 in the morning, she got up and stood at the window for a long time. The canal was dark. A single light was on in a building on the opposite bank. Someone else awake at 4:17, for reasons she would never know. She thought about the 37. She thought about the teacher in the file, the retired postal worker, the father of 3 in water management. She thought about what it meant to be removed from a system that everyone had agreed, without entirely noticing that they had agreed, would determine whether you could board a plane. Access money. Prove you existed to the institutions that required proof. She thought about Vivienne. About the 20 minutes at the dinner for 12 people 7 years ago. About the 3 questions. About the answer she had given to the 3rd one. The honest answer. The one she had not given anyone else. About the decision she was not proud of, and had never entirely resolved. She thought about what it meant that Vivienne had remembered it, that she had built a selection process around it. At 6:03 in the morning, she sat down at the table. She opened the tablet. She looked at the 5 names for a long time. Then she did something. 1 year later. A terrace. Warm light. The sound of water somewhere below that was not a canal. Wider than a canal. Longer, moving differently. A coastline. A woman sitting in a chair with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold because she had been reading and forgotten to drink it. The coffee the way she had always made it. 2 measures. No milk. No sugar. Some things do not change with a name. Her phone screen lit up on the table beside her. She did not reach for it immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading. Then she set the book face down on her knee, careful not to break the spine. A habit she had never managed to lose. And picked up the phone. A news alert. Global crisis consultant Elara Voss missing. Feared dead following corporate collapse. She read it once. Her expression did not change. She set the phone back on the table, face up. She picked up her coffee, looked at the water. After a long moment, she set the coffee down and picked up the phone again. She opened an application. A file loaded. a name at the top of a short list. Her thumb moved to a position just above it, and remained there. The water moved below the terrace. The morning light shifted very slightly as a cloud passed somewhere above. Her thumb did not move. She was still deciding. Perhaps she would always be still deciding. She closed the application, set the phone back on the table, face down this time, picked up her coffee, and looked at the water.
If this story made you think, subscribe. The next one goes even deeper.